Star Wars The Grey War, Chapter 10 by Nathan Brown.
10. We need to return to Coruscant, Master Sifu said suddenly. Kinza whirled around to face Master Sifu, who was sitting on a chair in the back of their ship. I'm sorry, I know you want to find this Rogan, but I just don't think it's possible. We've been searching for almost 5 months and we're no closer to finding him. He spoke in a soothing voice, clearly trying to keep Kinza from freaking out. What are you talking about? How can we leave when we haven't found him yet? Who knows where he is or what he's doing? Kinza practically yelled at him. As she raised her voice, she realized she was losing her cool and overreacting, but couldn't stop herself. Exactly, Master Sifu said quietly but fiercely. No one knows where he is. Our traveling around on this ship, grasping at straws and following after rumors and lies isn't doing anyone any good. We need to return to Coruscant. We're useless here. No more useless than we are back at the temple, Kinza blurted out before she could think. Master Sifu nodded knowingly and waited for her to recover from her outburst. I'm sorry, Master Sifu, I didn't mean that. I'm just frustrated is all. Kinza backpedaled quickly. It's okay, Kinza. I've known for some time how you felt and I've been waiting for you to bring it up. Feel no shame and don't worry, this will stay between us. Speak freely with me about what's upsetting you. Master Sifu motioned for Kinza to sit down. Try your best to keep your emotions out of it. Kinza sat down and took a deep breath, slowly letting the air fall from her nose and letting her emotions drain out of her. I feel useless in the temple. I don't see the point of the Jedi if all we do is stay on Coruscant. And not only do we stay on one planet, but we stay in the shiny upper crust of the planet, not even trying to help all the people we share the planet with. I know that some Jedi, especially the Sentinels, help out on other planets, but the majority of us aren't. I became a Sentinel so I could go out and help the galaxy, but I ended up recruiting and feeling just as useless. I felt like I was just recruiting for something I don't fully believe in. Jedi are just begetting more Jedi, but we're not doing anything to help anyone. Just because the Sith are all gone doesn't mean that all evil in the galaxy has magically disappeared. I'm sure there are things out there that we can do. The reason all the young Jedi are thinking of leaving the Order is because we're all disillusioned and restless. We grew up on the stories of the glorious Jedi, fighting back the Sith, the first line of defense for the rest galaxy. Then we were proud when we were chosen to be a part of it, but now we want to do something. We've been born with this amazing gift and given this wonderful training, and now we want to give back to the galaxy, but we feel the Order is holding us back. So I don't want to go back to Coruscant because at least here we're trying to do something. Kinza looked down at her feet, not wanting to see the judging look on Master Sifu's face. She felt ashamed now that she had spoken her thoughts aloud to another person. She had been thinking about this for a long time, but now that she had vocalized it, she felt terrible, like she had betrayed the Order. She had never participated in the discussion with the other young Jedi, and so this was the first time she had talked about this to anybody, and it was to a master on the Jedi Council. I understand, Kinza. It is not only the young knights who think this Order isn't doing everything right, Master Sifu replied slowly. Kinza looked up, shocked at what Master Sifu had said. Master Sifu continued, speaking softly with a faraway voice. Only a fool follows something blindly. The galaxy is changing, but the Jedi aren't changing with it. Too many of us cling to the past, to the traditions of the ones who came before us. I know the Order is flawed, but I urge you not to leave. The people like you, the ones who see we need to change and have the ability to affect change, leave. Then how can the Order ever get better? The older knights and the masters would be angry at what they saw as a betrayal and would take it out on the new Padawans and the knights who stayed. They would be even harder and stricter on them, trying to keep them from ever rebelling. Then there would be two factions of the light side. One would be rigid and old-fashioned, without creativity and, some would say, without purpose. The other would be young and wild, without the wisdom or guidance of the elders. The two groups would grow further apart, generation after generation, until eventually they were at odds with each other. It would no longer be Jedi against Sith, but rather two groups, neither right nor wrong, but fighting each other. The Jedi gain strength from their unity. That's why we've always been able to defeat the Sith. The dark side lends itself to individual power, and so they were constantly fighting, backstabbing, arguing, and betraying each other. The Jedi may have arguments as well, but we can't fall apart like them. We need each other if the Jedi are to grow and evolve while still remaining in the light side. He finished his speech and stood up from the couch. I'm going to leave you so you can think about it. Kinza sat in silence as Master Sifu entered the cockpit and closed the door. Scene change. Naman blew a deep sigh as the warm water shot from the show head, falling onto his head and running down through the cracks in his scales. He stayed for a few seconds, taking a moment to relax and just be still. His flesh gave a soothing, shuddering ripple as the temperature of his body shifted, matching that of the water rolling off him and pooling at his feet. His training session had just ended an hour ago. His muscles were worn and tired. He wasn't sure how much longer he'd be standing before his legs turned to jelly. As usual, he'd done terribly. His black scales were covered in scratches and burns, from falling to the stone floor and being tapped painfully by his master's lightsabers. With an arching stretch of his tired back, he shook himself from his stupor, grabbing the metal bristle on the shelf. As he started scraping his scales, cleaning away the grime and buffing away scuffs, he heard Darth Cognu's music floating through the house. He had a small grin as Corellian jazz continued. He imagined his master listening to the smooth but unbelievably loud song played. He wondered what she did while listening to the blaring music. Perhaps she just sat quietly in her room, using the deafening noise to block out her thoughts, emptying her to give her a stronger connection to the Force. He liked to think, however, that she danced about in her large room, swaying back and forth to the sounds. His grin grew into a chuckle as he played the scene out in his mind. Perhaps on the day he challenged her, he would make sure he did it during this time, so he got the chance to see what she was really doing before their partnership came to an end. Scene change. Darth Millennial pounded his fists against the wall of his meditation chamber, his rage blocking out the pain as his skin shredded against the rough stone. It had been months and still he had nothing. The Force was silent to him. Reality slowly began piercing his veil of fury and his hands throbbed with pain. His ragged, short breath slowed down and he came back to himself. He looked down at his bloody, torn hands in anger and frustration. This wasn't the first time since he had gotten his vision, or lack of vision, that he had lost control. Using the Force to compartmentalize and push away the pain, he thought about the larger problem. Perhaps the Force had turned away from him because of something he had done wrong, or more likely something one of his followers had done. There had to be some way he could regain his gift, something he could do, or give. Scene change. Naman sat with his large legs painfully crossed, alone in the cold, dank training room. He stared at his extinguished lightsaber, about an arm's length away. He was waiting for Darth Cognu's to return, waiting for another miserable failure. It had been well over a year since he had constructed his lightsaber, and yet he still couldn't control it fully. It simply didn't feel right. He felt no connection with the strange, weightless weapon. He had become a devastating practitioner of the dark side. He He could command storms of lightning, he could lift hundreds of holograms with a mere thought, he could make the dark side manifest in a crushing wave that would overwhelm a person and devastate them emotionally and mentally. He had become extremely proficient at augmenting his body to be faster, stronger and tougher in battle. Yet despite all this he failed at the seemingly basic task of lightsaber combat. "I have a mission for you," Darth Cagnus told him suddenly. Naman got to his feet and whirled around. He hadn't even heard or sensed her coming. "Yes, Master," Naman replied, covering his surprise. "I've learned of an ancient Sith artifact on the planet Voras on the borders of the Outer Rim. I need you to go there and retrieve it for me. This is your first true test. It is a mysterious and deadly planet. There are many vicious animals roaming the planet and the artifact itself is guarded by a large group of cultists. This cult that protects the artifact is almost as ancient as the Sith themselves. Generation after generation have been born and died there with the sole purpose of protecting the artifact from people like you. Their members have no connection to the Force, but they are experts in martial combat and not to be underestimated." In his head, Naman was worried about his chances against the animals and the cult if all he had was the lightsaber he was still so sloppy with. Before he could voice his worry, Darth Cagnus spoke again. "I know your thoughts, my apprentice, but cease your worrying. Even without your lightsaber, you have become an impressive and capable vessel of the Force," she said, speaking in a warm voice Naman wasn't accustomed to hearing. "However, I encourage you to use your lightsaber as much as possible on this mission. See if you can learn to use it in action. If not, then when you return we'll find you another weapon to use." Scene change. Cagnus could see excitement flickering in Naman's eyes at the mention of receiving a new weapon. Although he had advanced rapidly in his training of the Force, his skills with the traditional Sith weapon had continued to lag far behind. As time went on and still all he could master were the most basic moves, she had started worrying that perhaps she had once again chosen the wrong apprentice. After all, how could he one day lead the Sith if he couldn't learn enough to train his own apprentice, or, for that matter, how would he ever defeat her at all? While thinking seriously out the possibility of abandoning Naman as an apprentice, which of course would mean killing the young man she'd grown somewhat close to, upset her, she had been thinking it was her only option. Luckily she'd received a vision of her apprentice while pondering the dilemma. She saw him going to Voras and receiving the artifact that would set him on the path to becoming a complete Sith. She, however, thought it best to keep the specifics of the artifact to herself. "You will leave tomorrow. In our chamber, I've placed a data pad with information on Voras, as well as supplies for your trip. This will be the last time we see each other before you return. Good luck, my apprentice." Cagnus turned from her excited apprentice and walked to the narrow stairway. She left the dark stone room behind her as she entered the warm, upper levels. It would be strange not having Naman around for however long it took him to complete the mission. She'd spent the last year and a half or so spending the majority of her time training him. She'd need to find something to do with her time now. Scene change. Kinza spun to the left, circling to the outside of the blue blade aimed for her chest. As she spun, she brought her right arm up, letting her elbow connect with her opponent's jaw. The man staggered back and Kinza pushed her advantage. Still with her back to the man from her spin, she used her strong legs to propel her into a backflip. As she sailed over him, she brought a quick strike down on his head. Her opponent brought his blade up just in time to block, and Kinza landed behind him. She quickly stabbed at the man's back, determined not to lose her advantage. She was astonished when the man pivoted sideways, without even being able to see the lightsaber, faster than Kinza would have thought possible. He brought his free hand down on her wrist, forcing Kinza to drop her saber to the ground. She felt no fear or anger as she heard her lightsaber extinguish and clatter to the ground. Only shame and disappointment. She looked into the eyes of her victorious opponent, and they smiled. "Well done, Kinza," Battlemaster Radar praised her, gasping for breath as he placed his lightsaber back on his hip. He used his robe to wipe the sweat off his face. The attack from the air was completely unexpected. He continued between breaths. "You will make an excellent shadow. I have no doubt about it." "Thank you, Master Radar," Kinza replied, panting herself. She knew she should be happy with her performance. She rarely ever got any sort of strike on the esteemed Battlemaster, but she still couldn't help but be disappointed in her failure. After Kinza had been forced to return to Coruscant, she had chosen to change her path in the Jedi Order. When she first became a knight, she had chosen to become a Sentinel, the smallest branch of the Jedi, the other two being the Guardians, whose lightsaber crystals were usually blue and who were more proficient at lightsaber combat than the Force, and Consulars, recognized by their green lightsabers that they preferred to leave strapped to their belts, relying instead on Force abilities and diplomacy. The Sentinels blended the two together and relied as well on non-Force abilities such as hacking, demolitions, medicine and many others. Usually beings recruited later than the average date for a Jedi were the ones who became Sentinels, bringing their expertise from their past life and incorporating it into their work as a Jedi. Sentinels often got the jobs other Jedi couldn't do or did not want to do. They were the ones that spent the most time away from the temple, preferring to use and hone their skills to help the galaxy. This is why Kinza had chosen to be a Sentinel, wanting to explore and help the galaxy rather than stay in the temple. However, because she was so untrained, the only position she was qualified to occupy was that of a recruiter. Since her time back on Coruscant, almost a year, she had been training in all aspects of the Force in an attempt to acquire a different position. Just a week ago, based on her performance and a recommendation from Battlemaster Radar, she had been accepted as a candidate to become a Jedi Shadow, and Kinza couldn't be more relieved. Sentinels were the smallest class of the Jedi and the Shadows the smallest sect of the Sentinels. Only the leaders of the Shadows knew how many members there were. Not even the Jedi Council was privy to that number. Most other Jedi knew almost nothing about the grayer side of the Jedi Order. Jedi Shadows traveled the galaxy, following up on whispers of dark side activity. Just because the Sith had been destroyed didn't mean the dark side had disappeared. Cults formed on distant planets, and, if the Jedi weren't careful, any one of them could easily grow in numbers and strength until it was akin to the Sith. Being a recruiter for years, Kinza was adept at searching for signs of the Force in people, and she believed she'd as well suited for the position. As a bonus, if Rogan would be found anywhere, it would almost certainly be in some unknown dark side cult. Scene change. Darth Millennial lifted his apprentice's body in the air and used the Force to reach into the chest of his squirming follower, wrapping around his heart with an invisible claw and tearing it out. Holding the male acolyte in the air, he let the heart drop to the floor of the sacrificial room he'd had his disciples build only a couple of months ago. He watched the blood drain out of the hole in the dead apprentice's chest. He pushed the small body into the roaring fire and let it be taken by the flames. The blaze expanded quickly as it accepted the body, and Darth Millennial stood strong as the heat singed his face. Dressed in elaborate and heavy ceremonial robes, he had started sweating uncomfortably a long time ago, but he bore it all. He brought the fresh heart into his outstretched hand and turned, holding it out to the crowd of terrified disciples. They stared up at him with a mix of fear and nervous excitement in their eyes. They all feared to be next, yet they all yearned to be next. To be a part of his new mission, to give their lives up to fully serve him in the Force, it was their deepest desire. He had finally found the solution. The Force had become upset with her champion and had turned away from him. So he would sacrifice his acolytes until he received a more specific vision. He reached out with the Force on Abd, another of his loyal followers. The crowd around her gasped with envy as she was brought forward, being pulled by the unseen strands of the Force. As she neared him, her thrashing stopped as tears of joy streamed slowly down her face. Tonight he would surely get a full vision. The mistress would no doubt be appeased. Scene change. There is no ignorance. There is knowledge. There is no fear. There is power. I am the heart of the Force. I am the revealing fire of light. I am the mystery of darkness. In balance with chaos and harmony. Immortal in the Force. For what had to be the dozenth time Kinsa looked over her shoulder, afraid that someone would catch her. The Jedi archives were particularly busy, and even though the section detailing the history of the Order was one of the more sparsely populated ones, there were still enough people walking by to worry her. Even though what she was doing wasn't wrong, she still felt like a child sneaking treats, worried her parents would catch her in the act. She was sent to this branch of the archives to research how the Sith had formed. It was supposed to help her understand the dangers of letting dark-side users gather together uncontested. She had been surprised to learn that the Dark Order had actually been founded by former Jedi. This group had started following the dark side and launched a war against their former colleagues, a war that raged for a century, one that spawned dark rituals and twisted creatures. In the end, these Dark Jedi had lost and been exiled by the victors. After leaving Republic space, these men and women had found the unbelievably ancient Sith, a red-skinned species that had gone extinct long before Kinsa was born. When these Dark Jedi intermingled with the evil, Force-sensitive species, they shared their knowledge in the dark side, interbreeding until they became one group. She found it strange and curious that after all these years as a Jedi, she was only now learning how their ancient enemies had been formed. Interested in learning what else she hadn't been taught about the history of the two orders, she had kept digging. This is how she'd come across the Jedi Order and their code. The Jedi had been a group of Force sensitives that had been formed on Tython. The group had followed neither the light or dark side of the Force, called at that time Ashla and Bogan. They were named after the two moons of the planet, one of which was bathed in light and the other covered in darkness. These early Force users had made maintaining the balance between both sides of the Force their highest priority. In fact, if they felt a member of their order had strayed too far to one side or the other, then they were sent to the opposite moon to meditate until they had found their center. This peace and balance had ended drastically in an event called the Force Wars. The one side held Ashla as the greatest good in the galaxy, while the other believed that only Bogan could give them the power needed to affect the galaxy. The battle raged on between the two sides until the followers of Ashla emerged as the victors. They had fled from the ruins of their order and the corpses of those they had called friends and became the Jedi Order. Not long after that, they joined the slowly growing Republic as its protectors and leaders. More even than the formation of the Sith, she was shocked that the Jedi weren't taught this story as Padawans. The fact that their ancestors worked for centuries to ensure that their order never strayed too far into the light or dark seemed extremely significant. She looked around quickly to ensure no one was watching her before going back to her reading. She would find out more about where the Jedi came from. Scene change. Naman awoke early in the morning, knowing without looking that it was 0600. He had stayed up late studying up on Voras. He had started with its current inhabitants but had quickly become more interested in the famous Sith Lord who had been born there, Darth Simus. The man had been a pure-blood Sith, the red-skinned, long-extinct species that had been fighting with the Force long before that Jedi or Sith Order had started their deadly feud. He had been a great warrior of the ancient Sith Order until a rival Sith Lord had beheaded him. Using long-lost Sith magic, he had survived, becoming just a head in stasis. Despite this obvious disadvantage, he descended to one of the highest positions of the Sith Council and had trained one of the greatest Sith in history, Naga Sato. Apparently the planet he had been birthed on had been abandoned and was now overrun completely with forest and wild animals, with the exception of one small corner of the planet that had been cleared and protected by the lifeless monks, as the cultists called themselves. The artifact would no doubt be in this corner, built around the apparent birthplace of Darth Simus. He knew how to get to the temple, but there was no information on the interior. The cult immediately attacked anyone who came close to the temple. So far, he had no concrete plan of how to get into the temple, but in these past years of training, he had come to trust fully in the Force and his ability to utilize it to adapt to any situation. Once he got to the planet, he was certain the Force would show him a way in. Scene change. "Thank you, Master Farrell," Kinsa said, bowing low. "I appreciate this opportunity. I will not disappoint. I'm sure you will not. Jedi Knight K. Una. I, and the rest of the leaders of the Shadow, have complete faith in you. You've excelled at all the tests and passed all our expectations. You are already one of our greatest fighters, and I dare say, there are few masters who rival your Force powers," Master Farrell replied, beaming down on her from his high chair. Kinsa had just received her first assignment. There was a small cult in the Mid-Rim that she was being sent to investigate. She had been ecstatic when she'd first gotten the assignment, and now, after those words from Master Farrell, she could barely contain herself. She was finally being given what she always wanted, a chance to prove herself, a chance to fight back the darkness and protect the galaxy from the threat of an evil empire rising in the shadows. Scene change. Naman stepped onto the planet, the soft, black grass giving in and folding under his massive foot. He felt a strange jolt that hit his feet and then traveled up his leg. It felt like a miniature wave of dark energy sent from the blackened ground itself. He took another step and felt it again, a pulse of pain and energy sent forth from the ground in response to being trod upon. After a few more testing steps, he grew more used to it. The pain faded away, but the feeling shooting up his leg was still there, registering just barely above his subconscious. He pushed away the feeling and turned to lock up his ship. The planet was supposed to be abandoned, but there was no use taking any chances. He had landed in a large clearing of the forest, the closest he could get to the temple without being torn to shreds by their anti-aircraft defenses. All around him the thick forest rose up and blocked his way, with the notable exception of a wide path that seemed to be heading towards the temple. He started down the path, hoping it really was leading to the temple. He didn't feel like pulling out his lightsaber and cutting his way through the forest. Up until now he had been too focused on the pain of this new phenomenon to take in the majority of his surroundings. Now that he did, the thing that struck him most was the air, the essence around him. All around him he felt the Force flow. It felt like the air the moment before Sith lightning was produced. It was imbued with the dark side and felt like it would burst at any moment. Every breath filled him up with the Force and made him feel heady. He had to control himself in order to stay focused in this dangerous environment. A huge, deep blue sun loomed over the planet, taking up the entire sky and casting the planet's surface in an almost purple hue. The vegetation itself was almost all black, from the soft, tall blades of grass to the monstrous trees that seemed somehow darker than the black shadows they cast. They looked like they were silhouettes at sunset or twisted, ghostly imitations rather than the actual thing. As Naman walked deeper into the forest, he noticed that almost none of them grew straight. Only the tall street of the towering timbers shot up in a straight line. All the other smaller saplings had twists and knots in their trunks and especially in their branches. As he looked around at the twisted woods, he noticed something even stranger. As thick and tightly packed as the forest was, none of the trees touched. No branch was hitting another branch or a trunk, and none of the trees grew up together, eventually melding into one like often happens in a normal forest. Each and every tree was its own calm, complete and contained individual. Some trunks were thin and squeezed between two larger trees, others twisted and turned as if they were avoiding some invisible barrier around the other trees. It seemed like the ones that had been established first had grown straight and forced the smaller ones to twist and turn to avoid the original trees. So far, he had been walking on a path in the forest, clear of plants on both sides by at least a meter. He had thought it must be a path maintained by the cultists, but now he remembered that they hardly ever left the temple, and they certainly wouldn't want a path to lead strangers to the temple. He set this problem aside for a moment and walked off the path towards one of the massive trunks that shot straight up. He reached out with one hand and touched the bark. Immediately a terrifying wave of pain blazed into him, tearing through his body. He dropped to the ground, lying supine on his back with the pain swirling and burning around his core. Then, as suddenly as it came, it evaporated, and he was left with the dull wave sent from the ground he was lying on. No, not the ground, he realized. The grass. The vegetation of this planet, which had been drinking in the force of its environment for millennia, had somehow adapted to use the dark side as a defense mechanism. He slowly brought himself to his feet, his muscles still twitching from the dark side energy that had just coursed through him. He returned quickly to the path, marveling once again at the force presence at this planet. He had heard of non-sentient animals using the dark side when submerged in a force-rich environment, but never of vegetation doing the same. He already had a lot to report back to his master, and he hadn't even come within view of the temple. After about an hour of traveling the unnatural path in the unnatural forest on this unnatural planet, he felt something in the force. Not the blanket dark side energy that had been hovering around him since he lay dead, but a more specific signature. He stopped his slow jog for a moment and recognized it as the signature of a weak force user. He stayed still and waited for it to approach him, not wanting to run into it without seeing what it was. Only a few seconds later, a blood-curdling scream broke the thick silence, and a large bipedal creature came crashing down on him from above, leaping down at him from a far tree. Before the animal could reach him, Naman gathered his force and shot a ball of dark energy at the animal. It hit the beast in the chest and sent it cartwheeling away. It landed in the middle of the path and quickly bounced to its feet. Without missing a beat, it came bearing down the path towards Naman, sending forth a screeching battle cry as it ran. He recognized the animal instantly from the information he had read the night before. It was called Yaren. It stood just over 1.5 meters tall but was extremely slender. It had incredibly long legs and arms with a disproportionately short torso. It was covered with long yellow fur, making it seem much larger than it was. According to what he had read, it was a herbivore. The lack of teeth in its open, growling mouth confirmed it. Even though it wasn't a hunter, it was still extremely dangerous. It was very territorial and attacked any animals that entered its zone, including other members of its own species. It had long talons it used for digging at the end of its long arms. Apparently, the ground where the animal made its home was poisonous to most species, and, as a result of digging through the poisonous soil, its claws were said to cause you to fall into a deep sleep if it cut through the skin. Naman, not wanting to give the dangerous animal a chance to get close, shot off a stream of Sith lightning at the charging beast. He was pleasantly surprised at the devastating storm he conjured without even trying. It spread out from his hand and filled his entire view with bright blue tendrils of electricity. He was even more surprised, however, when the Yaren emerged from the wall of crackling energy, unfazed and sprinting towards him. Naman immediately stopped channeling the lightning and jumped backwards, trying to get out of the creature's reach. As he jumped back, the Yaren lashed out with one of his long, spindly arms and struck him hard on the shoulder. Naman was still in the air, and the forceful blow knocked him off balance. He spun and landed hard on his stomach. As he slammed to the ground, A sharp jolt of pain shot up at him from the ground. As he jumped up to defend himself from the next attack, he noticed that the animal was just sitting still on the dark grass, waiting patiently. Naaman took a step forward before he understood. Every time this animal had hit something, it had been knocked unconscious from the poison. It had become trained by instinct to wait for his victim to drop unconscious. Luckily, Naaman's scales had protected him from the Yaran's sharp claws. He slumped back to the ground and waited until the beast came to dispatch its helpless victim. The Yaran rose to his feet and slowly walked towards Naaman, still slightly cautious. Naaman kept his eyes closed but used the force to sense where the Yaran was. Once he came within a meter of him, Naaman gripped his lightsaber tightly with his right hand and placed his left hand on the forest floor. He force-pushed with his left hand and used it to spin him around, launching him to his feet. He drew his lightsaber. As he spun to face the animal and swiped at its short torso, once again, he was surprised by the strange creature as it jumped back, easily avoiding his slash. Instead of chasing after him, Naaman simply sent his saber out, flipping end over end towards the retreating Yaran. Naaman breathed a sigh of relief as the glowing blade plunged itself into the beast's chest. He reached out his hand and force-pulled his lightsaber back and placed it onto his belt. He walked past the body, splayed out Alan, achieved a clear path and worked out the confusing encounter. He assumed he was able to produce such a great volume of dark power because of the dark force saturating the atmosphere, similar to how he felt more empowered by being around a stronger force user like Darth Cognus. The Yaran brushing off his lightning was slightly more complicated. Though it was rare, he knew there were multiple species, both sentient and non-sentient, in the galaxy that had developed a natural force resistance. It made sense for the creatures of Voras to be one of them after living for thousands of years on a planet saturated in the dark side. He just didn't know why he hadn't read any information about it. He considered the possibility that his master had kept the information from him to challenge him. It certainly seemed like something Darth Cognus would do. It was more likely, however, that the few people who had come to the planet and survived hadn't been force sensitives. The other mystery was the specify CS of the animal's force resistance. When he had used the force to simply push the animal away, it had worked, yet the amazing amount of electricity that had gone through it seemed to have no effect whatsoever. He'd heard about species that were resistant to mind persuasion, mind reading, and even some that were resistant to all aspects of the force, but he'd never read about a species that was specifically resistant to lightning. The more he thought about it, the more he believed it was a result of the strange vegetation. When he had touched the tree, the pain had been similar to the feeling of Darth Cognus' force lightning. Because the animal was a herbivore and apparently traveled in the trees, it must have evolved a resistance to the force defenses of the planet. Naaman imagined that it had almost been an evolutionary battle spurred on by the force, the vegetation evolving force defenses, then the animal's evolving resistance to it, then the plant's defenses becoming even stronger, and the animal's resistance responding in kind, until now the trees released a paralyzing, devastating attack at being touched and the animal shrugged off the most potent lightning attacks. This planet was much more dangerous than he had expected.